And David says, I got this from Joseph Smith. And I think he did. Joseph was telling him he would see the top line would be the characters on the plate, and the line below it would be the English translation. I don't think the Book of Mormon translation that Joseph Smith got is literally what's on the plates. But I do think that all the events being described are, in fact, real events. They're not being made up.
Yeah, you believe it's based on an ancient text. It's a historical text about ancient people.
It is a historical text, but it's being redone in things that make it easier for us to understand. And in a way, you can say then Joseph Smith could make the changes from early modern English to more modern English to make it so we could understand it, because it's already being done.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's episode. I'm going to be interviewing linguistic scholar and expert on the Book of Mormon, Royal Skousen. Royal, thank you for joining me today.
Yep, glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I've done my own series on the Book of Mormon. I was mainly exploring a lot of the criticisms leveled against the Book of Mormon, evidence in favor. I've brought on different sort of faithful scholars. I've also talked to a couple of critics as well, and I've been interested in geography theories and also translation theories as well. And I want to bring you on, do an interview with you, as you're probably the living expert and preeminent scholar on the Book of Mormon, the text of the Book of Mormon, the multiple editions that there are of the Book of Mormon as well. And what we're hoping to do in this interview is to talk both about the translation, the text of the Book of Mormon, some of the changes or differences in the subsequent editions, and to talk about your research with Stan Carmack about early modern English as well. And then just to get your thoughts on alternative either translation theories or naturalistic theories or questions that people have as well. But this should be a really exciting episode. But for any people who aren't super familiar with who you are, I would say most of my audience would be. Maybe give a brief bio, your scholarly background as well. You're a linguistic expert, and then talk about your work in the Book of Mormon. And you've been doing a critical text project. Maybe talk about that as well.
Okay. Well, this project began with a conference at BYU, and myself and Jack Welch, head of FARMS, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, and a research assistant, Lyle Fletcher, who was doing a transcript of First Nephi from the original manuscript. And we were discussing the results of our preliminary work and comparing it to the 1984-86 work that had been done by Bob Smith for FARMS. It was a critical text of the Book of Mormon. It was inadequate in several ways. Mainly, he did not have access to good transcript of the original manuscript. He had a very poor microfilm version, and really so many things couldn't be read properly. He also did not have electronic versions of the editions of the Book of Mormon. About 20 needed to be identified as necessary for determining the text. So I proposed in that meeting that we do it again. And we get good access to really good photographs of the original. And Jack Welch said, I'll work on that. And within a few days, he got permission from the LDS Church for me to have free access to all the photographs they had of the original manuscript. Most of these photographs dated from about 1950, and they were in black and white, ultraviolet light. And you could really read stuff that normally you couldn't read.
And isn't it correct that we only have around 28% of the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, and they have 25 and a half. They do not have the full 28. The Wilford Wood family owns about 2.5%. University of Utah owns half a leaf. And, there's a family, the Ada Cheney family, that owns the fragments to about a leaf, an entire leaf. So it's sort of scattered. But what I wanted to do was to get really good photographs first, to work from photographs. Later, I will actually examine all the pieces. I've examined all the original pieces themselves, looking at them directly under UV light and other kinds of things. So that was an important discovery, because then once we had the electronic versions of 20 editions plus electronic versions of the manuscripts, I wrote a program I wrote it in Pascal, an old-fashioned program that really worked for me, and was able to make a computerized collation, which would line up the 20 editions and the two manuscripts word for word. So if there's any difference, it's going to show up. I had the punctuation, capitalization done automatically, but I did not try to do any letter differences. Letter differences, it would stop and say, how do you want to line this up? And most of the time it says, well, line it up with this word, just a difference in spelling. But sometimes, there was an extra word or a word was missing and stuff. The off-the-shelf collation programs, particularly one from Oxford, would automatically do the lining up for you. And actually, I didn't want it to do automatic, because it would very often line up things the way I didn't want them. So I developed the program so I could shift the words the way I wanted them and make them all line up. And so that took me, actually, first I had to get the electronic versions of all the editions, electronic versions of the two manuscripts, where there was an insertion in the manuscript, so I had to make it in the line. I had to bring it down into the line and say, here we have an insertion going in, and so forth.
And when you say the two manuscripts, you mean the original and the printer's manuscript?
Printer and the printers, yeah. The original is what they got from dictation, and then they copied it, and that's
right.
Called the printers. So having done, I was then prepared to start making the computerized collation. It took me 3.5 years, because I was stopping with every significant change and making observations and trying to keep track of what was going on. And so about 1999, I started in 89. After 10 years, I had a pretty good transcript of the original, 28% of it. I had a pretty good transcript of the printer's manuscript, virtually 100% of that. That was owned by the RLDS Church at that time, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So they're going to change their name shortly. But so I had those sources now, and I had them all lined up. And then I started to do research. And at first, my research program just was a linear one. You'd go through the collation and look for, say, spoken versus spake. He had spake, he had spoken. And so I'd look up, every one of these spakes and spoken and try to say, what do we have here? How many cases do we have had spoken? How many cases do we have had spake, which is non-standard? And we got examples of both of them, and I was taking account of this. after doing this, we published in 2001 the transcripts, and in 2003, BYU has a program that is a word cruncher program. I don't know if you're familiar with word cruncher, but you can write in anything and it'll tell you all the sources that have this and so forth. And that's what I really needed. Instead of going linearly through, 4,000 pages of lines looking for something, this thing would do it automatically for me. So by the end of 2003, Monty Shelley and some of his staff had come up with a very good word cruncher version of the collation. So I could just put in what I wanted to look for. You look for, and it came to pass, and you get over 1,000 of these things. And you get the ones that were deleted by Joseph Smith, for instance. But it's all in one screen. I mean, one big screen. You can scroll down. So I don't have to go linearly through the whole collation hunting for all the examples. Okay, so then having done that, I decided, okay, now I need to make start determining what the original text was. Originally, I was going to study what the text was, but I realized, well, I don't know what the text is. I've got to figure out what the original was. And so that's part 4. So I ended up doing part 4 before part 3. And so part 4 went from 2004 to 2009. There's 6 books, marine colored books. And so I had it. And I could look up anything, and I had a big discussion of every variant that was significant, not all the grammatical ones. And this led me to then I could start making the part 3. Part 3 is the history of the text. So, for instance, the first 2 books deal with all the editing that's been done on the Book of Mormon.
In like subsequent editions?
Yeah, well, Joseph Smith did quite a bit. James E. Talmage did a lot. Talmage's editing is not really very helpful. It's just sort of trivial types of things. Hasn't been conveyed that way. But Joseph Smith, it turned out, when he made his corrections, only 2% of them were correcting bad grammar. And 94% were changing Old Style English or Book of Mormon English to modern English. 94% of his changes. And this is against what most people convey, as saying what he was doing. He was cleaning up all the bad grammar. Well, this is not really an accurate description. What he was doing was making the Book of Mormon more accessible to English speakers. And
understandable to the 19th century audience at the time.
Yeah, so even something, he makes a lot of examples like he hath done it to he has done it. And the hath, of course, is the biblical, the older style, and he just changes it to has, which is the modern English. And so it turns out the great majority of his changes were updating the language. And I'd always said that, just from my examples that I'd gone through, that he wasn't going in correcting all the bad grammar as people thought he was. He was doing some, and he did 2% of them. And it turns out his typesetter added another 1% of bad mistakes just by accident. So bad grammar snuck back in through the back door with the typesetter putting in ones. So there's still things you could complain about in the current text as being inappropriate or something like that.
Okay.
So ultimately, I did that volume 4, and then I did a revised version of it because everything had been sort of scattered, and I changed my mind sometimes as I went along and so forth. And then I started doing these, the nature of the text, and that's where I got into first the editing, and those are the first two books. It's called Grammatical Variation. Then the next two books were on the nature of the original language. And by that time, Stan Carmack, my colleague, and I had discovered that there was usage throughout the original text of the Book of Mormon that was not Joseph Smith's English. It wasn't even always quite early modern English, but it seemed to be located in early modern English for the most part. And this was quite surprising to us. And there were words that were being used that were the way they were used in early modern English and not in Joseph Smith's time. So what's going on here? And I eventually came to the conclusion that the text is being given in early modern English for the most part, but not totally. And there are exceptions to it. And we'll probably get into some of those exceptions.
Yeah. And was this around, what, 2017, 2018 sort of time you and Stan Carmack were discovering and writing papers and articles on this discovery of early modern English in the text?
Yeah, and Stan concentrated a lot on the syntax, and he discovered that the syntax seemed to locate from about 1550 to maybe 1630. So it overlapped with the King James Bible, but it isn't always identical to the King James Bible, but it's in that period.
Right, because it was translated in the early 1600s, 1611, I think.
Yeah, the 1500s. We get things in the Book of Mormon that are not in the King James Bible, but are in samples of English from 1550s and 60s and so forth. This was, originally the first one I found was In Them Days. And, this, we all think, oh man, that's really pretty hick language here, In Them Days, and making fun of it. It's twice in the Book of Mormon. But in the OED itself, and the OED editors were very surprised that they found academic writing about 1600 cases of In Them Days. And this is academic writing. This is not, just some hicks that came out of the woods and were writing this subject matter. One was about wars and one was about the Mosaic Law. And so they used them instead of those. Well, it turns out that originally in early modern English, there isn't a standard saying, this is correct English. They haven't really developed this sense of a standard.
So it was considered like acceptable grammar in early modern English.
There are,
in them days.
It's going to take to the late 1700s before people dealing with the language in England start writing up, this is correct and this is incorrect and so forth. And so that's 100 years away. So whatever people write, whatever they put down is the way they're using it. And we find this in the Book of Mormon in large part. Now, there are some things we find that are not early modern English. And one of them has to do with the word retain. And retain usually means to keep. I retained my book. I kept my book. However, in the Book of Mormon, there is a really bizarre use of retain, meaning to take back. And Latin, reteneo, literally means to take again, to take back. And yet, that has never occurred in English, to take back for the meaning of retain. You go through the whole OED, and they all mean to keep possession of, retained it. And so it's sort of surprising that you get about almost a dozen of these. And what's even more surprising is you think, well, maybe it's in Latin. The Latin literally is to take again, retenio. Well, it isn't in Latin either. I went through all of Short and all the samples he had of retenio, and it all means to keep, not to take back. Yet there in the Book of Mormon, there's a general is fighting with Moroni, and he says he retains his sword. And from context, you say, well, that means he took it back from Moroni. Moroni had his sword; he had given it to him, and then he couldn't agree to their conditions, and so he retains the sword. He gives it back.
Almost in modern speech, you would think a better word would be reclaimed for us. He reclaimed his sword, but
it reclaims it or something. That's right. But it isn't. And this is a usage which I can't find anywhere. I mean, see, so we get, and it's not even in Latin. It's not sort of a Latinization, so it's just there, and I just say, well, it's just there. and there are other things like this. I'll mention the Hebrew one. We found a number of places where there are Hebrew-like expressions, and these are also the ones I'm going to mention now we can find in the King James Bible, a literal translation for the most part. But you get things like in the King James Bible, Saul went to battle and his army. So this is a displaced, conjoined subject matter. Instead of it being Saul and his army went to battle, it's Saul went to battle and his army.
Yeah, it's a funny way of saying it.
But that's the way they say it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the Hebrew. Well,
Right.
You find a good number of these. I list them, maybe a dozen of them in the original text of the Book of Mormon. And for the most part, they're still there. And so that's an example of Hebraism, I think. One of the ones that I discovered first, and I said it was a Hebraism, was sort of a mistake on my part. It was when you have a complex subordinate clause starting out a sentence, you can, when you complete it, it will not have something like a connective element, like then or something. It will just say and then. So an example in English would be something like, it would be, I went to the, or no, let's see, what was the example? I gave one here. Well, if you come to the party, or no, if you want to come to the party, I'll send you an invitation. Okay, that's a regular if-then kind of statement. And that's the way it is in the Book of Mormon. But if there was an intervening clause in that subordinate that sort of broke up the way it was flowing, it would not end with then, but it would end with, let's see, and then. So it'd be something like, if you wish to come to the party, and surely you should, and I will send you an invitation.
So is this an example of if and conditionals instead of if then? This is an
example of if and, but it only occurs in the Book of Mormon, and almost consistently if there is this conditional interruption in the subordinate clause. If it isn't, if it's just the straight if then, there's no additional and. So it helps bring you back to the original subordinate. If you come, and surely you should, then I will send you an invitation. And then I will send you an invitation. The and is there. It's not in English. And in Hebrew, it is in Hebrew. But Hebrew has all of these. If you say, if you want to come to the party, and I will send you an invitation. It doesn't need that subordinate, but the Book of Mormon has a restricted form of it. And I don't know what to make of this. Do you want to say it's a Hebraism, or maybe it's something else? And some of the linguists at the University of Illinois were looking at this and were seeing if there were a possibility in discourse of getting, when you get it interrupted, you can add an and if instead of just an and they didn't find much, but that's something. It's just something that's in the Book of Mormon. It's not technically a Hebraism, but it is sort of a Hebraism. So okay, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, yeah, it's interesting that, Hebraisms are something pointed to throughout the Book of Mormon, like, I have dreamed a dream or rod of iron. And I think I find the if and conditionals interesting, because normally in English we would say, if you do this, then this. But as you said, if and is sort of acceptable in Hebrew. And if you believe that this is, a translation of an ancient text with a mixture of Reformed Egyptian and maybe underlying Hebrew, is that making its way into the translation, or is this a product of utilizing KJV material? But do we find if and conditionals in there? That it's quite an interesting thing. And you mentioned there, like, do if and conditionals show up much in the environment or other texts that people use that in Joseph's time?
Yeah, well, it's I don't want to call it something that it might not be. I mean, it looks Hebrew-like, but it's not fully Hebrew. I mean, the full Hebrew one would put the ands in everywhere. And this one only puts it when it's necessary to get back to the main clause. And we get things like this in the Book of Mormon that I have not found anywhere else. There are the traditional ones. There's evidence for, instead of King Noah, there's some cases where it's the King Noah. And the is Old English. They put the in front of king and then the person's name. But it's all in Hebrew. Hebrew throughout does it this way. The King Stephen, the Queen, I think Vashti, the Queen Vashti, instead of Queen Vashti, we would say that. So the Book of Mormon doesn't have it everywhere, but it has some of these cases which make us think, oh, that looks fairly Hebrew-like. But there is some of that, but then I'm trying to say there's some that are sort of marginal on the outside of things, and they behave differently than we would expect.
Right. We can't say they're definitively Hebraisms, therefore showing this is an ancient text per se. That's interesting.
Well, it may not be an ancient text, but it's a different text.
Yeah.
And a very complicated one, I think, much more than people have, just disparaged the text and said it was a hick up in New York putting this thing together. Well, the evidence doesn't really indicate as much. And so, when I found the example of in them days in about 1600, and there's a note from the OED editors that they were very surprised to even find such an uncouthism there in the middle of the Book of Mormon text, and it's there, and so my feel that then Stan Carmack out of the blue wrote me this article and went through all the grammar, the bad grammar so-called, of the Book of Mormon, and showed that it was all in early modern English. So if Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon is using this bad English, what is it? Is it his upstate New York English? Or is it his this early modern English. You can't really tell from that. But when we went to vocabulary, we started finding examples of meanings that did not fit into early modern English, fit into early modern English, did not fit into Joseph Smith's time. For instance, errand. I got mine errand from the Lord. And we look at that and we say, well, I got my, what was it? We want task, I think.
Yeah, that's what came to my mind. Like your task.
My task from the Lord, my errand. But actually, errand originally meant message. I got my message. And you're supposed to deliver the message. And what's interesting is that in Jacob, when he talks about getting his errand from the Lord, if you read it in the context of the two chapters around it, you see that Aaron here must mean his message. I got my message from the Lord, not I got whatever our modern reading. So we tend to do these modern readings into them, and I think we're re-looking at the whole thing, and it makes a difference then if you translate. And if you want to translate Jacob, you want to say, I got my message from the Lord instead of I got my task or what I was supposed to do. So those things start showing up. And okay, well, maybe it's all I'm saying is it's a very complex situation. I think it deserves a lot more serious study than just simply declaring, well, Joseph Smith is wandering out in the woods and coming up with weird things. And there's no evidence. I have challenged people. I said, look, if you think that, say, Aaron is used this way, go up to upstate New York, study the letters of people, handwritten letters and so forth. See if you can find Aaron being used in that way, the old way. And then you could say, if you found quite a few of these, you could say, Joe, this is just his own dialect. Well, I've challenged them and they've not come up with one that they can shove into 1800s. It's all previous stuff. And so for the moment, I'm saying, we got to have evidence. And if Joseph Smith is actually using his own language, whatever this is, and it's got all these things in him, then let's find some examples. So Dallin Oakes, the son of the apostle, I sent him up to Palmyra area and to read the handwritten letters from the 1820s for bad grammar and all kinds of things. He didn't find really any of the evidence for the syntax, bad syntax per se. He would find things like "they was" occasionally in these letters and so forth. He didn't find, I mean to say, he didn't find the vocabulary items. It's hard to find, errand in these letters. So, there was the evidence suggests that the people of New York were speaking standard colloquial English at the time, and nothing particularly like the Book of Mormon style. So I voted against it being just his own dialect, his own word uses. They got to find examples. They say, why don't you look into this? Not one of these people who said, he's using his own upstate. There's Quakers up in that area, and he's being influenced by the Quaker speech. Well, give us an example from his writings, his early writings, very early on. See if you can find any evidence for this. And they haven't found any. And without evidence, you can't build theories. It's my feeling.
Okay. Do you mind if we come back to this? Because I have questions I want to ask about early modern English.
Well,
But I
go
thought
ahead.
maybe for the rest of part one, maybe we could talk about
Okay.
your knowledge and your expertise and understanding of the translation of the Book of Mormon,
Okay, let's
the
go for
testimony
that.
of eyewitnesses, and talk about the original manuscript as well and how that supports it being an
Okay.
orally dictated text. Because some of the early theories were, things that Drew Smith must have had another manuscript like Solomon Spaulding, or
Oh,
him and
yeah.
Oliver Cowdery were collaborating together to write the Book of Mormon. So yeah, talk about the eyewitness testimony, the time frame, and how the original manuscript supports that this was an orally dictated text.
Yeah. Well, I think one very important factor, which I brought a lot of attention to, is there's evidence that the scribes could spell out the names if they needed. If you get these Book of Mormon names and you've never seen them before, and they could spell them out. Joseph would spell them out. He didn't do it all the time. He only did it usually first or second occurrence of the word, not later on,
Right,
because
because it's already been spelt once or twice.
and then once they're spelled correctly, you can leave them spelled incorrectly because the typesetter will know from the first ones how to spell them. And that's one, and that would give witnesses the idea that this is letter perfect. We're going to make this thing letter perfect. The other factor had to do with about every 30 words or so, they would read back to Joseph Smith. The scribe would read back the last 30 words or so. And we can see this because there are corrections being made to the original manuscript. And the ones I was looking for in particular are corrections that make no difference in the meaning, but they're difference, like it might be the placement of an adverb, and instead of in front of the verb, it's after the verb, and so forth, where either reading would work. And it's corrected to whatever the proper one is. And if they're just going with a text which is supposed to be representing what they're thinking, if they're dictating it off their minds and so forth, there shouldn't be any need to have to change these 15. And we know they were done later because they're either in lighter ink or darker ink. So it means when they got done with the 30, Oliver, usually he would dip his quill and make a correction. But the correction doesn't make any real difference. But this to me implies they've got to get this thing down exactly word for word, whatever Joseph Smith is seeing. Their job as a scribe is to get it that way. And so I think the evidence is for that. And in my mind, that was when I presented to the first presidency and other people in a press conference. I emphasized this aspect because what it implies is that this is an actual text, and Joseph Smith's job is to read it off, and the scribe's job is to get it back, get it correctly, and to read it back. If they have to spell a word, they will, but that's less frequent than every 30 words they're going to repeat what they just did. Now, I think from those two things, right, the writing down letter by letter of the names occasionally, and the actual, what do I want to say? And then repeating over and over every 30 words. So a person watching this is going to hear spelling out of names, is going to see this thing being done perfectly by making sure the words are absolutely correct. Now,
For example, you give the example of the name Coriantumr being written in the original manuscript by Oliver Cowdery. He wrote it probably the way that he heard it, and then
yeah,
it
he
was
did.
crossed out, implying that the spelling was corrected, and that Joseph was telling this is how you spell it. I think you also give examples of times where there would be an error, but the scribe would be like mishearing the
Yeah,
dictation.
that's
So there's going
right.
to be and versus and as well.
Yeah, there's very plain evidence that it's being dictated and that it's being the words are being spoken. Um, the people watching this came to the conclusion, four of them, that uh, they were not allowed to go on. The instrument would prevent them from going on if it was wrong. And I give clear examples of every scribe that we know of, that we have, making a mistake that was never corrected.
Right, that exists in the original manuscript
Right in
as
the original
evidence.
manuscript. So this idea that they couldn't make any mistakes, it would stop them from going on, is not true. So where were they getting this idea? Well, I think it's because they did spell out the names and they restated every 30 words and to check it. And so these people aren't particularly, knowledgeable, but they came to the conclusion, the wrong one, I think, that it was word perfect, letter perfect because of the spelling. It's the misspellings are terrible, I mean, it's just ridiculous to say that they knew. But you see, these people, David Whitmer's not a great speller, and he's commenting on these things. And Oliver Cowdery at this time is a lousy speller. Martin Harris is one of the scribes, and he was a better speller than Oliver Cowdery at that time. I in book 6, I show how Oliver gets better with his spelling over time
So you
because
see it as because there's some evidence of the spelling out of names or the correcting of names that these scribes or eyewitnesses assumed that the entire translation, the entire text, must be written down perfectly. If there's
that's
any
right.
errors, the translation instrument wouldn't let them move on, and that was maybe an incorrect assumption.
And I
And
don't know where
sometimes
they're getting
there's
it
correction.
because, the actual evidence in the manuscript says this isn't right. This isn't right. They're allowed to make errors. Their job is to be as careful as possible.
Right.
And one of the things which I have found, and I'm going to state this, um, the Lord, I believe, gave the text through the seer stone. We're going to talk about that a little bit, about how that happened. And so they are given this text, but from every stage on, from Joseph Smith's reading it off, even reading, I give 4 examples where I think Joseph Smith misread what he was viewing, not the scribe putting it down, but he misread it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And it's in that chapter on witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and I list at least 4. There are potentially more that they made mistakes with. So even Joseph might misread it. So I used to say my transcript represents what Joseph Smith um, dictated. And I now say, no, we're trying to recover what he was reading. And he could dictate it wrong. He could make mistakes. And so there are 4 there. One of them is talking about the woundedness of people. Terrell Gibbons loves this word, woundedness of these people, but woundedness looks like wickedness. And if you put wickedness in there, it works much better than
Makes more sense.
woundedness, which isn't even in the OED. You can be wounded, but woundedness is just not there. So I think he made up that. He misread it, and so you have that. And then you have the scribes are going to make mistakes, various mistakes, mishearings and so forth. And then they're going to copy it. And boy, there's going to be lots of errors in the copying process or the typesetting process and subsequent typesettings. Very often people say, and they're working on the Book of Mormon project, that the Spirit tells us that something's wrong here and we have to find it. And so they stay up to 2 in the morning looking for this error that's supposedly in there, and they find some tiny little error in a footnote or something, when there's, of course, 600 and some misreadings in the text itself. There's lots of errors. But I don't like this idea, because they try to, and they find it, these people, they find the error, find some error. It's supposed to be a period in a footnote. Instead, it's a comma, and they correct it, and they feel, okay, now we've got it. And they're giving the false implication that there are no mistakes, that the Lord is making it so that whoever is called upon to do the text of the Book of Mormon, they're not going to make any mistakes. This is not true. I don't think we should stop doing this, and I know apostles that were in charge of it, but that doesn't mean that they did it perfectly. In fact, so I've come to the view that the Lord has intervened only once in the transmission of the text, and that was what he conveyed through the seer stone. Now, we might as well talk about the seer stone, because a lot of people don't like it being used. And Joseph Smith didn't like it, because he says in his statements that he used the Urim and Thummim that came with the plates to do the translation.
Right, yeah. He and Oliver tend to emphasize the Nephi interpreter. So yeah, that was going to be one of my questions.
Well, he never even mentions the seer stone, because he got pushback, really bad pushback on using the seer stone. And the reason was that he had used it for treasure hunting, and that had already been reported in Mormonism Unveiled and everything, and he was very sensitive to it. And apparently it didn't work for him as for treasure hunting, his seer stone. We don't know how he ever figured out that this stone could give him a text in this way. He gave a description of it to David Whitmer that I think we have to look at very carefully, because David Whitmer reports this 8 times. And the first accounts he gives, he says that Joseph Smith would use the seer stone. He'd be in a hat, and it'd be like this, with the brim right up to the top, so it's dark. It's very important. Some of the artists now are showing him peering into a hat, but all the witnesses saying that it's up to cut out the light, not to just peer into it. So I don't like those artworks that are lying, and they know they're lying. They even said, I did it with him with his face up to the brim of the hat, and it looks so ridiculous, I just couldn't do it. The artist says, well, I don't care what you think. Do it the way they said it was. Anyway, so they're looking, and this is what David Whitmer said initially. He said he wasn't looking in straight to the stone, but it projected some parchment.
Yes.
So it's sort of like Star Wars and Princess Leia being projected out, I think, more than literally reading letters in the stone. Now, and David says, I got this from Joseph Smith, and I think he did. Joseph was telling him he would see the top line would be the characters on the plate, and the line below it would be the English translation in bright Roman letters. Now, whatever that means, I don't know, capital letters or what, I'm not sure. But he said the first couple times when he talked about this, and he gave interviews, or he said it that way, parchment, and it projected. Top line was the characters on the plates, bottom line, the translation. It looks pretty literal, doesn't it? In any event, that's what he was claiming, David Whitmer was. But he tells it 6 more times. And by the time he gets to the end, he tells it in his own words, and it's wrong. He says that Joseph Smith could see one character from the plates and the sentence that corresponded to it. Well, there is no language in the world where a single character represents a sentence. Now, it can represent a word or a concept like in Chinese and so forth, but it doesn't, there's just none. You can't get all the information into a single character to represent this. And that was what he said at the end. And I think it just is bad memory that's conveying that misinformation. But because he wrote it, it was the only one in his own hand, the historians go with it. And I don't think they should. I think they ought to be much more critical of that claim. Well, in any event, 8 people saw Joseph Smith put the seer stone in a hat. One of them said it was a stovepipe like Abraham Lincoln's hat, a tall one. They put the stone in it, and he put his face right up to it. There are 8 of these people. 3 of them were never Mormons. This is very important.
Right.
They're non-Mormons. They have no reason to lie or to make up or to defend these people. They're not even knowledgeable of these other people as witnesses. 2 of them were teenagers and were in the home. One of them, a girl, gives a very sort of scary description of Emma Smith's miscarriage and what the stillborn baby looked like. We don't have this in church history, but she tells it, and it's pretty moving. And anyway, there's David Whitmer there, and there's Martin Harris, and they could say they were apostates and so forth. But there are other people that give it that never were apostates, never left the church, or never were in the church. And they all say the stone in the hat. And it goes all the way back to Reuben Hales, the brother of Emma. Mm-hmm. And that means the 116 pages at the very beginning. So we have the Whitmers said that they could use, that they were using the Urim and Thummim before they got there, before it was done there in their home. That is, they're incorrect. It's being done almost from the very beginning of using the seer stone. And Martin Harris said he could use either one, the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah, sort of interchangeably. And I think there's a kind that talk about he switched to the seer stone for convenience as well.
Convenience, and I want to show you why it's convenient. The seer stone, you just come in, put the stone in the hat, put your head up to it, and start dictating. You don't need anything else. You need just a scribe to take it down. The other one, you apparently had to view the plates, and you would put on the breastplate and these silver bows, and inside the bows you have to have the 2 stones, and you would view then the plates. And somehow then the plates would probably give you the same kind of thing. We don't know exactly the image of the characters, and underneath it the translation. But no one was allowed to see the plates yet. So you got to do it behind a curtain. So if you're going to go in and do the original version that Mormon had devised for translation, it's awful. You've got to get everybody out of the room and you put up the curtain. Then you have Joseph behind it with the plates. We have evidence from Martin Harris in telling Charles Anthon and telling a minister, Clark, about his getting the original sheet around the curtain to take to New York. So it's really the very beginning where we find him trying to do this. Somehow he figured out that the seer stone was going to do it for him. And we have no idea how this took place and how he discovered it. Or the Spirit said to him, why don't you try that old seer stone over there that it failed to find treasure. Maybe it'll find a textual treasure for you or something. We don't know. But Martin Harris said he could use either one because it was more convenient, and it definitely was more convenient. I think this is an important thing to note. Now, Joseph and Oliver never say that they say he used the Urim and Thummim.
Right.
And Joseph is not literally lying, but he's misleading because he only did it in the very beginning. Oliver Cowdery says that he did the whole thing that way, implies he did the whole thing. And yet we have accounts of Oliver Cowdery doing the translation with Joseph using the seer stone, 3 of them. So it's with his case, he's prevaricating, to use instead of saying lying, he's prevaricating. He does, and the reason for this is very simple. They don't want to bring up the seer stone because they'd been used for treasure hunting, and it just gives the whole, he had been really ridiculed for the treasure hunting business, and they just didn't want it. It's a mistake. We do this in our church history even today. We change things so that it looks better, but it doesn't look better. It ends up looking worse.
Yeah, there's a sort of hiding or concealing. Now, whenever I did some research into the Urim and Thummim versus Seer stone debate, I want to get your thoughts on this because I found a couple of sources from Joseph and Oliver. Primarily, all their statements talk about the Urim and Thummim. I found a couple. One was Jonathan Hadley, whenever they first went to, get the Book of Mormon printed. And Jonathan Hadley, who wasn't a member of the church, and he was quite accurate about other details, talked about Joseph said he translated by putting spectacles in a hat. And I found another source of Oliver speaking to, might have been a Quaker, or I can't remember who it was, but talked about either like putting 1 stone or 2 stones in a hat.
I know. I talk about this in my chapter on witnesses. Yeah. And I reject those because, first of all, they are secondary of one person telling another, and they don't fit. The 8 that say you put the stone in the hat are all in full agreement of what's going on. But you get secondary ones, you get these mixtures of, 1 stone or both stones in the hat or something like that. And I don't think the actual Urim and Thummim was done. It was done with putting on this breastplate and all. It was complicated, and he just didn't want to bring it up any longer.
Okay, so your view of the translation, you think primarily the primary instrument was the seer stone put in the hat, and you believe that Joseph Smith was seeing and reading off the words of the translation to the scribes.
That's right. He's reading them off. He's a reader. In fact, even one of our, I forget who it was. He was the president of BYU, Idaho. What was his name? Bednar. In the last conference, he said Joseph Smith read off the text. Amazing. I thought, man, that's really some advance. and
that would align with the eyewitness testimony of witnesses as well, scribes, how they talked about the translation, that he was reading the words and dictating it as well. There's sort of this debate in apologetic circles between tight versus loose being...
Well, I made up that distinction.
Yeah, I think I was about to say, I think you came up with
that. It has to be refined, and I did refine it. Tight translation was that they're seeing the words, but their job is to get it down correctly, and for the most part, they're going to get it down correctly. So that sense of tight, but it isn't foolproof. It isn't foolproof. And it's not loose, because loose would be you just read what you have and then just say, well, it means sort of this, and just give it in your own words. And the other one I talked about was ironclad. And that's what these witnesses, the 4 witnesses, say, that it was ironclad. You could not have it deviate, not even in spelling, not in anything. And it is so obviously false. I don't know why people can't just go look at the manuscript and say, well, this isn't true. They're not. They're making all these errors. And then I found the ones where they made actual errors. The led their God instead of the Lord their God. And it's just who that. I guess the instrument was falling asleep or something at the time and let these things through. Well, okay. The reason I bring this up is I have never had the Spirit tell me that this is the correct reading or this is not the correct reading. It's something else. I've had to find everything that I put in it has been from my own work, research, and finding, and I've never had a confirmation even this is the right reading and so forth. Because first of all, I think my project is supposed to be a scholarly one, and I'm not to have footnotes like you know, personal communication from God. I'm not to have those kind of things, and I don't. It's interesting that even in the corrections the brethren have made in the text, they never refer to the Spirit as giving them answers. They always say something like, "We have examined the early manuscripts and editions and have found evidence that certain reading should be changed." And they don't make any claims. And I think that's right. They are telling the truth. They haven't gotten, anything where the Spirit said to us, this is what it should be. And but a lot of members of the church automatically take that as, it's being done by the Quorum of the 12 and it's under their direction and so forth, and therefore. And so once the Lord gave the text, it's in our hands and what we do with it. And so there is a place for the scholarly work to be done. It has to be done by someone, I think, who's a believer, which I am. My own personal experiences have confirmed, what I've also figured out by academic means. But they're consistent with them. There's no such thing, though, as, yes, this is the correct reading. You got it right, Royal. That's not coming.
And I
that's
think
okay.
similar to the early scribes and eyewitnesses of the Book of Mormon translation who assumed an inerrant translation that was perfect word for word, I think often Latter-day Saints, we can grow up believing that similarly with both the text of the Book of Mormon and the Book of Mormon translation. As you said, there are errors found throughout the original manuscript in the translation, but even in the Book of Mormon itself, it doesn't claim to be inerrant without mistake. In fact, on the title page,
It
it says,
prepares us for errors, and we ought to
if
be
there are
more.
mistakes, they're the mistakes of men, condemn not the things of God. So it's still saying that there's divine intervention, but also errors of man, not only probably by the Nephi authors who wrote it themselves, but also in the transmission of the translation as well.
Yeah. And they said, but we know of no errors. Well, that sounds like me publishing the Yale edition of the Book of Mormon. I know of no errors, but in 10 minutes, I find an error.
Yeah, we want to say like, oh, there could be errors in it, but nobody wants to point out, oh, this is filled with errors.
I point them out and change them. I said I made a mistake here. I realize I'm going to make mistakes. So
right. Maybe in wrapping up before we're going to take a break and do a part two. I've got some more questions, but I want to get back a little bit to the tight versus loose translation because often the distinction has been like tight is sort of like word for word. Drew Smith is reading it from the translation instrument. Loose being he's receiving the inspiration, the ideas from God, and then he's expressing it, clothing it in his own language and vocabulary.
That's the way I generally do it. Yeah.
And I guess one question I have is you believing that it was a tight translation or that there was a divine translator that put the translation on the instrument. What relationship do you see between the translation and the plate text? Like, do you see it as a literal word for word equivalent of the underlying, say, plate text? Obviously, we don't have the plate text to examine. Or do you see it as some sort of a cultural or functional translation or
Yeah.
rendering of that plate text, but it's appearing
Yeah.
word for
Well,
word?
I think it's a literal one-to-one, that part. But I don't believe that it represents directly what was on the plates. So the translator is innovative and is making the cultural and the creative changes. The cultural ones are, for instance, the bar of God. The bar of God is a medieval term. The legal bar is from the 1300s on. It is not in the times of the Book of Mormon. They always have the judgment seat where they would make judgment and so forth in the Book of Mormon. And same thing in the Bible. Why? But it's in there. It's in the Book of Mormon. What's interesting in the Book of Mormon, it is only with respect to our day of judgment, not anybody in the Book of Mormon. Nobody's being judged before a bar of God, but but in when it talks in the Book of Mormon about our day of judgment, then it does talk about the bar. So you could say, well, the Lord tells Moroni, I just want you to put in the word bar here. You don't know what it means, but just put in the word bar. I don't think he did that. I think Mormon just wrote probably something like the judgment seat of God or something like that. But the translator, which I decided it's the Lord, it's too hard for a committee to do it. And I'm against committees anyway. So I just say, well, I think it was the Lord. So he wanted to put an image for the readers of the Book of Mormon, which would be living for them, you and I, and we know of, the judgment bar in legal terms and so forth. So that's what's used in the Book of Mormon. But I don't think the plates had judgment bar.
Right.
There is this sense of loose translation there,
Yeah, sort of
but
like a
it's being
functional equivalent that's more applicable to
applicable
the
to our
culture
time.
that's going to
Yeah,
receive it.
that's the cultural one. And the creative one has to be things like you're going to use a King James uh, phraseology, which is actually wrong, mistranslated, and yet it's still there. It's put in. And I just look at those and say, well, that's what the Lord wanted. He wanted the King James one, even though it's incorrect. So
Do
I
you mean
don't.
that there's some passages that are King James Bible, either passages or phrases that contain either what some scholars deem to be either incorrect, maybe translations
Yeah.
or errors of that translation? You're saying that some of that's making its way through, and you don't believe that that was necessarily on the underlying, original plate text, but
Well,
it's again,
even if they had the King James version, it was something. It was the correct one then. So there's a place where it talks. What is the term I want? It's a belt or something, and it's supposed to be a rope, but it's translated as something else completely different. And it's well, I can't get the thing out right now. But
that's
the
okay.
point is that you got really hundreds of King James phraseology. You got the direct quotes, which I say you have to have at least 16 in a row. I make a really tough cut. There's, almost, I think, 100 of these things. I forget the number, but there's quite a few. Long quotes from the King James Bible. Some of them are from the New Testament and not supposed to have been written yet.
Right.
And
Yeah, that
I
was
don't
one of the
have any
questions I was
problem with
gonna.
that.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had on here to bring up to you about, you've got, like, for example, Moroni 7 seems to be quoting passages which are nearly verbatim to Paul in First
Yeah,
Corinthians on
13.
charity. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
I read a chapter the other day, Alma 7, which I really loved that chapter. I shared a lot as a missionary on the gospel of Jesus Christ. But as I've been sort of analyzing, I was finding not like verbatim passages, but like little phrases scattered from like the
Right.
New Testament in either some of the gospels or the letters of Paul. And
Well,
what's your
I give
take on that?
examples. I give examples of this that just sort of astounding the merging of all these things together.
Hmm.
And I just come to the conclusion that's sort of the creative aspect of the translation, and the cultural is the ones like dealing with the bar of God. So I don't think the Book of Mormon translation that Joseph Smith got is literally what's on the plates. But I
Hmm.
do think that all the events being described are, in fact, real events. They're not being made up.
Yeah, you believe it's based on an ancient text. It's a historical text about ancient
It is a
people.
historical text, but it's being redone in things that make it easier for us to understand. And in a way, you can say then Joseph Smith could make the changes in from early modern English to more modern English to make it so we could understand it because it's already being done in the original.
Hmm.
So I don't have any problem with any of these so-called, King James things, anachronisms and so forth. And the bar of God is definitely an anachronism. Um, but it's interesting that that only takes place in the future when we're at the bar of God being judged.
Hmm.
It doesn't describe anything historical within the book.
Just a way to almost
So,
express the translation. And would you see it as like maybe these King James Bible passages or New Testament phrases, or like the example of the bar of God being like the translator rendering the meaning? It's sort of like it's functional, but it may not be literally word for word, but it still captures the meaning
well, it
of.
captures the meaning because you're being judged, and but it uses the word bar. It You could have said judgment seat, which is the way the Book of Mormon normally, a king has, or will, even Pilate sat upon his own judgment seat in the New Testament to judge Christ, and so you get those kind of things, and they're in the text. It's sort of an interesting. Um, I'm not one. So if you have the wrong translation, and so forth, well, then you do. And it doesn't really interfere with, I think, a person's personal testimony.
Hmm.
And my own testimony comes from Alma 19, where the queen of King Lamoni comes out of her trance. And the text I was reading said that she comes out and she cries out with a loud voice, I have seen my Savior, and he has saved, he's saved me from an awful hell, she puts it. And then it says she clasps her hands. That's what the current text says. But the printer's manuscript, which we have, says she claps her hands.
Hmm.
And it's an interesting difference. Yeah, the clapping shows much more of a Pentecostal nature. And then the following sentence says, and then she spoke in words that no one understood. Now, this is really Pentecostal. She's speaking in
Speaking in
tongues.
tongues. Right.
And it's interesting that the original French, the original German, the original Finnish all had her clapping her hands. They didn't have access to the printer's manuscript, but they understood it was Pentecostal and they translated it as clapping, not clasping. So, that I find interesting that translators themselves may discover some of these readings. And in any event, we have a text that is, I think, prepared by the Lord. I decided some people originally I toyed with the idea there was some committee, of Protestant people or something, working,
Between like the 15 to 1700s.
Yeah, but it's a big committee, and it's really sort of bizarre to think that way. But in any event, I've finally decided no, it's too hard for a committee to do. So I'll just say the Lord did it, and we'll not worry about it. So that's sort of the view that I've taken on
That's your
that.
view. Okay. Well, I think this has been a really interesting discussion so far, talking about your work. We've touched on your findings of early modern English. I'd like to ask maybe a few more questions of that in part
Yeah,
two, and then talking about the translation theory. And I think we'll take a little break now, and then we'll come back and we'll do part two, and we'll ask more questions on
all
early
right.
modern English and your thoughts on the translation and alternative translation theories, or your thoughts on naturalistic theories as
Yeah,
well. But I appreciate this time to discuss the great work and knowledge that you've done on the Book of Mormon. And listeners as well, if you've enjoyed this, give it a like, comment underneath. I also put in the description where you can find some of Royal's work as well to read more in it as well, and come back for part two.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.